some divine loving heart is pouring love into your body, and it's coursing through your veins and making your heart beat and making your diaphragm move and making sensation and thought turn through your head and animating you and giving you an opportunity to wake up and realize that that's happening. I've been asked to say something about a difficult subject, to kind of take a little detour from our Into the Depths conversation and talk a little bit about teaching yoga in difficult times such as this, in times where there's a lot of violence happening in the world. It's very natural for those of us who teach yoga, and I think those of us who are just practicing yoga, to feel sometimes like we're doing something that's out of alignment with reality, like either in practicing or teaching, that we are tuning our attention away from what truly matters. And perhaps the thought behind this feeling, behind this misgiving, is that what matters more than anything is the suffering of others and the atrocities that are happening for some of you, I know, rather near to you geographically. And however near or far you might be geographically, to the terror that is being waged upon especially upon places in the Middle East. You might be emotionally very, very near to it because there may be people that you love in those places. So I wanted to address this feeling of misalignment, if we can describe it that way, between yoga practice, yoga teaching, let's just say the exploration of yoga during these times. It's my thought, ultimately, that practicing and holding space for others to practice yoga is extremely important in these times, perhaps more important now than ever. And so I wanted to share some thoughts that might help to bolster that feeling in you, to help bolster that sense. And I thought that the most appropriate way to do that is just to reflect on what we're doing when we're practicing yoga, and to bring into focus what our yoga practice is all about, in a way that the importance of practicing in these times is really apparent, really vivid. I don't think that's a terribly difficult thing to do. I think there are many, many ways of doing it. Just yesterday, was it? I was kind of wrapping up a yoga retreat here at Purple Valley in Tenerife, and it had been on the background of my mind, what to do on Saturday when I'm addressing the people and thinking about this very difficult, this difficult question. Difficult simply because of all of the difficult emotions that surround it. And in wrapping up that retreat, I was giving a talk about more or less about the meaning of yoga, and a few things jumped out at me. And so I thought I would return to that same constellation of ideas and kind of draw out some things that are perhaps slightly different than I spoke about yesterday. I'm saying this in part for the benefit of people who are here in the room with me who are also at that talk yesterday. Okay, so without further hesitation, let's get into it. The verse that we chanted together just a moment ago, the second of the two verses, is a piece of dramatic poetry from Bhartrhari dating back to, I think, the 2nd century of the current era. And the translation of that verse is something like this. You were me, and I was you, and thus it was that we were one. But what has happened now that you are you and I am I? And I love this verse very much. It expresses a certain sense of bewilderment that I think is one of the very common starting places for spirituality. Some of the most formative, most fundamental of spiritual myths seem to speak to this very bewilderment that's expressed by the chant. And the bewilderment in question, much like sorrow, as we've come to understand it, seems to have a kind of a presence that precedes the particular experiences that trigger it in ourselves. So we often have certain experiences in our lives that trigger this sense of bewilderment. I'll describe it in more detail momentarily. That trigger this sense of bewilderment in us, and we tend to associate the feeling with those circumstances. But if we step back and take a broader perspective, we might see that there's a certain kind of pattern in our lives that recapitulates itself in many different developmental stages that calls forth this same kind of bewilderment. And in trying to understand what that bewilderment is all about, and in trying to understand maybe even what those circumstances are all about, I think we can come into a very rich understanding of what yoga might be all about, and one that speaks to our question. So I hope that's not too complicated from the very beginning, but I'll start to explain now. So the kind of bewilderment that is at issue in this chant is a bewilderment at feeling estranged from something that once made you whole. A bewilderment at having a feeling of being isolated from that which once somehow completed you. Yeah? The poet's voice, right, is the voice of one who's wondering, and indeed wondering aloud, how could this happen? There was a time when we were so intertwined that there was no sense of deep existential separation between us. Now there's a kind of yawning gap or chasm between us. Perhaps it's even painful, and how could this be? Right. So, who is the character that's giving voice to this sentiment? I can imagine at least 3 different characters in 3 different developmental stages of life giving expression to this sentiment. One of them is a very small child realizing her existential independence from her mother. And perhaps you can remember from way back in your early years moments of realizing that your mother is not immortal, that she's not omniscient, and that she's not all-powerful, but on the contrary, that she has rather human powers of knowing, of doing, and of existing. She's mortal, she's fallible, and she's limited in her capacity to change things. That realization is part of the process by which a person starts to sort of recognize their own existential independence and to start to develop a sense of themselves as a separately existing being. And that's not an altogether easy moment for a person. That experience eventually gives way to a very strong concern with personal relationships with people outside one's immediate family. Right? So in teenagers, for example, relationships with others take on a profound importance. It's as if some kind of shift is happening away from the parents and toward, friends and boyfriends, girlfriends, etc. Yeah. Now, to understand what might be going on in that shift, let's remind ourselves that newborn babies need human touch. They need to be picked up and embraced. They need to be held against the heart of another human being in order to survive. It's a sort of biological, let's say, it's not a purely biological, but it's a proven fact that if newborn babies are given all the warmth and hydration and physical nourishment that they need for their bodies to survive, their chances of survival will be extremely reduced if no one picks them up and holds them. Most newborn babies, unless picked up and held, won't survive the first, I forget, 3 months, 4 months, 5 months, something like this. They won't survive the first year for sure. Okay. It's a terrible thought, of course, but there's also something very beautiful in the understanding of what it is that touch might give to the newborn baby. I'll tell you what jumps out at me. This is the way I understand it, is that the soul needs reassurance to come into this body and into this world. It needs reassurance that it belongs here, that it's okay for it to be here, because the world is, after all, a strange and difficult place, right? And the human body itself is a sort of strange existence, or at least it can strike you that way sometimes, can't it? It certainly does for me sometimes. I sort of wake up, or I'm, sort of sitting or having a reverie and suddenly become aware of my body again, and it can be rather startling, to kind of look down and see your own hands and look in a mirror and see your face. And probably for most of you, looking at your beautiful face in the mirror is less startling than it would be for me, but I freak myself out all the time. Anyways, it's a strange existence, isn't it? This human one and this kind of three-dimensional one even. And indeed, it's a harrowing existence. If you compare the existence that you had when you were still in your mother's womb to the existence that you have now, there's a striking dissimilarity. When you were in your mother's womb, you were, as the origin myths often say, floating in the primordial waters. And in that original state, everything that you needed for your nourishment and support was absolutely enveloping you. You had no sense of yourself as being separate from what you needed in order to be whole. You had no sense of yourself as being a separate being at all. Mm-hmm. And then suddenly, your world starts contracting and groaning, and the waters start rushing, and the next thing you know, you're thrown out into a blinding light and into a world of edges and of treacherous distances that you now have to navigate in order to procure what you need for your basic nourishment, survival, safety. It's a challenging circumstance. The soul needs to be welcomed in and reassured that it really does belong here, or else you can't really blame it for trying to seek more accommodating circumstances on another plane. And so it is that when a young person starts to realize their existential independence from the mother, right around that same time, they start taking a greater interest in relating to other people apart from their mother. Or very soon after, let's say, developmentally. You might consider that part of what a young person is seeking in seeking relationship with other people is a sense of sort of, communion apart from that which they're now realizing they once sort of, in some sense, wrongly took to be the absolute locus of their being. In other words, the very young child sees their mother as the world, as the cosmos, right? They experience their mother this way. They don't think that way, right? Once they start thinking, then they're thinking with more conventional concepts. And then as soon as they start thinking, they start to see themselves as being separate from the mother, and see the mother even as being separate from the world, see the world as being much bigger than the mother, right? All of that happens together. So they're seeing the world as being much bigger than the mother, at the same time then kind of having a contracted sense of the mother. However much love and reverence they may continue to have for the mother, they're realizing that the mother doesn't have the powers that they once imagined her to have, as they start to bring her into view as a separately existing being. So they start to take on these other relationships, and in these relationships, it's as if they're seeking out some kind of trace of that original experience of fullness that they once had before they started crossing this developmental threshold. And so it is that, that teenagers start to fall in love for the first time. And falling in love for the first time, you'll remember, often goes with the uncanny sense that the entire cosmos has been arranged just to bring you together with your beloved. That the joining of souls that goes with this encounter is a kind of cosmic perfection arranged by the highest of forces, and that it's so perfectly mandated by the higher forces that nothing could ever compromise this relationship. Anyways, that's how my first kiss felt. Right. But then, of course, a week or two later, the beloved is dating your best friend, and you have the sinking realization that it's really more of a shattering realization that you've been estranged once again, right, from that which made you whole. Yeah. Now, when teenagers mourn the loss of their first love, it's absolutely forgiving if part of what they're feeling is that indeed this other person somehow spiritually perfected them and completed them and gave them a sense of fullness that they could never possibly find on this plane again. It's not forgivable in a person in their 20s. It's neurotic, right? It's a problem in a person over 20. You forgive the teenager for thinking something like that insofar as they do. I'm not saying that absolutely everyone does, but I'm saying that it's more than just a common experience. It's almost archetypal, It's the Romeo and Juliet thing. In a certain sense, you wouldn't wish that experience away from someone that you care about. You wouldn't wish to spare them the kind of suffering that one suffers from falling in love for the first time and having all of these, what you might later think of as sort of naive ideas around the nature of the beloved. You wouldn't wish that experience away from them because you understand intuitively that, spiritually speaking, there's something to learn from that experience, something perhaps rather essential, something that you couldn't really learn unless you went through the experience of loving and of losing. To put this another way, I certainly do not hope that my children are spared from the experience of loving and losing. My heart will, of course, ache when they love and lose in empathy. But I'll be grateful as well for the opportunity to watch this process of spiritual unfoldment happening in this plane. Now imagine what it's like when a person doesn't learn the lesson, and we haven't really named this lesson. We haven't put words to it. We're just pointing to it. But there's something to be learned, we're saying, from that experience of loving and losing. And if a person doesn't learn that lesson, then they go on into their early and into adulthood, sort of, finding their way into codependent relationships and so forth. Relationships where they're relying on a particular other person for a sense of their own intrinsic worth, for a sense of finding their spiritual spiritual strength. It's as if they haven't quite found that alone yet somehow, and they seek a sense of worth from the validation of the other. And if a person continues to do that, and they go on sort of beyond, into later teenage years and into their 20s, they might get interested in spirituality or in some other kind of, it doesn't have to be spirituality, see? Not at all. But spirituality is one place in which this plays out, that they might seek a relationship with an authority figure where the relationship gives them some opportunity for validation, and perhaps the lack thereof, where there's some kind of, validation or not, something I need to do in order to get the validation and the approval of this authority figure in my life, right? And my sense of my own worth, my sense of belonging here on this earth might then, if my spirit is not developing properly, if my soul is not ripening properly in this world, my sense of my own worth might depend on the validation of another person. Yeah? You know that's, you know, and you can see, and you are familiar with the sort of dangers and indignities of that kind of situation. Yeah. And you see the spiritual impoverishment in it. Yeah. So what's missing is a sense of your intrinsic worth that allows you to know deeply, not just intellectually, but to really know in your heart and indeed in your very bones, in your physical being, that you belong here, right? It's that sense of belonging in this body and on this plane that the newborn baby, right, needs from the warm maternal embrace of someone who is capable of giving it, right? It's the validation that the young person seeks in their social relationships with others, the sense of belonging, and the sense of having a worth, right? Having a kind of worth that puts to rest those crippling doubts about whether one belongs. Right? And it's as if what one is looking for in these different circumstances, right, is this sense of intrinsic worth, then a deep knowing that one belongs here in this body and in this life, that doesn't depend on the approval of any other person or group of persons. Because insofar as it does, it depends on certain performances. It depends on what you give to other people, right? And if you feel that your worth depends on what you make of yourself, then you don't have a feeling yet of your intrinsic worth. Right? Now, hopefully you develop or somehow have a sense of your intrinsic worth from very young, but one thing to understand through reflection on these three different circumstances that we've talked about so far: the young child realizing its existential independence from the mother, the lover realizing its sudden estrangement from the beloved, or the sort of spiritual seeker perhaps having some sense of being completed in relationship to another, and then having that relationship, that very toxic relationship, break apart, as it hopefully does sooner rather than later, and feeling estranged and broken again, right? Or, I think perhaps even more interesting is, in the realm of the spiritual seeker, a genuine experience of communion with divine presence, a genuine experience of communion with divine presence that makes one, that gives one, that returns one to that original primordial sense of wholeness that one felt somehow in a time before time, right? And that one experiences as being almost like a remembering of something, a remembering of something. One doesn't necessarily learn in those experiences that one is an object of divine love, but one is awakened to that fact. And when one does, one is awakened to the understanding that divine love is always given to one, but that one is just not always receptive to it. That one is somehow distracted from it and doesn't receive it as openly as it's given. And one feels in those blessed circumstances that it's so obvious that it's something that one will never forget again. And yet often, even after one experiences such a thing, there is what St. John of the Cross called the dark night of the soul, which is an experience in which the divine presence is somehow astonishingly, bewilderingly absent once again. And one wonders, what has happened now? You were you and I was I, and thus it was that we were one, but what has happened now? Sorry, I was me and you were me and I was you, and thus it was that we were one, but what has happened now that you are you and I am I? That same sense of astonishment, as if that, even in that realm of spiritual experience, a certain event, a certain experience of oneself can trigger this old sense of bewilderment, of being estranged from something that once made you whole, right? Now, I want to point out, especially for those of you who are in the Into the Depths course, we were speaking about the kind of original myth, the kind of founding Vedic myth of Hinduism, as the myth in which there was once an original profundity of consciousness and creative power that somehow woke up from its dreamless sleep and wondered to itself, what would it be like for me to experience the spontaneous unfolding of these creative possibilities inside of me? What would it be like for me to unfold these creative possibilities into a space of sensuous awareness? Wouldn't that be grand? And so it fractured itself into millions of pieces, each piece containing a spark from the eternal flame of its own consciousness. Each spark illuminating an individual mind, an individual body with senses capable of experiencing thought, emotion, memory, of feeling itself and feeling the world around it. And so it began through that very act to unfold those creative possibilities and to contemplate them through the minds and senses of all embodied beings. Those embodied beings have, the myth implies, some nascent, intuitive sense of an existence before this one in which they were not cast out from the whole. They were not fragmented. They were not isolated from themselves or from each other, but that they were part of the original wholeness. Now they experience themselves as being isolated, and they're confused about that because they have this spark of the eternal inside of them, and they can feel that in some sense, and yet when they look at their individual bodies and minds and feel all of their limitations, they understand themselves as also being separate from that. And so they wonder about the worth of their existence. They wonder about its meaning. They wonder about its purpose. They wonder about their relationship to that strange memory. They wonder what to even make of that memory. They wonder whether to even call it a memory of a mode of existence before time as they know it, in which they were once inseparable from the whole. That creation myth, that origin myth, is about, do you see, it speaks to the same sense of bewilderment, the same feeling of estrangement, right? Also, in Christianity, the Genesis myth, the myth in which Adam and Eve wandered the heavenly garden, communing with God, right? Then Eve gets herself in a little trouble with the serpent. She bites the apple of knowledge. She gains a new awareness of herself. God had forbidden her to do that thing, and so he casts her out of the garden. And so again, they're estranged, meant to walk in a strange land, right? Wondering about their relation to the source, wondering about how to get back, wondering about how to recover, reclaim some original sense of fullness, that sense of fullness that they somehow lost when they were cast out from the original whole. You see how these myths, they speak to the same experience, and so too then do these formative experiences of realizing our existential independence from another, falling in love and losing, and then also genuinely having an experience of spiritual intimacy. And then feeling the fading of that experience and the return of that sense, that bewildering sense of being somehow isolated within this body and within this existence. these are fundamental human experiences. These are the experiences that shape our individual lives, and these are the experiences that these spiritual traditions are trying to help us put into perspective, and perhaps even more fundamentally, helping us answer the deep longings of the heart and the existential confusions that attend these experiences and attend the basic situation of human embodiment on which all of these experiences depend. So, we do at times find ourselves in our spiritual strength. We do at times feel our intrinsic worth, not just as human beings, as instances of a kind, but as the unique individuals that we are. And we do it, and when I say that we feel a sense of our own intrinsic worth, I'm not talking about the kind of approval with which we smile upon ourselves when we feel that we've done a good job. I don't mean the kind of self-esteem that accrues from having, somehow achieved, performed well, or captured the esteem of others. But I mean that fundamental understanding, which sometimes comes to us most lucidly in our darkest moments, but not necessarily, that our lives have an intrinsic worth and an intrinsic dignity, and that showing up for those lives is what we're tasked to do, and that the truth, the spiritual truth of these lives is to be uncovered by showing up for circumstances as they are, by embracing these lives, these bodies, these circumstances, these relationships, these conditions, and nourishing, loving ourselves and those around us. That sense that our lives have an intrinsic worth seems to me, given most definitively, most unwaveringly, most lucidly in the experience of being an object of divine love, of knowing yourself as one who is loved by that which has the otherworldly power of loving unconditionally. That otherworldly power whose source must be something that is unconstrained by the vulnerabilities and limitations of human embodiment. But most pointedly, to feel oneself as an object of unconditional love by the very source of being itself, of creation, the source of this world, the source of all human beings, the source of animals, the source of the cosmos, to know yourself as being loved by the same divine power that shapes the world from within, is to know your intrinsic worth in the most definitive possible way. Right? Because what could give you more right to be here, right, than that the one who is responsible for this the very existence of the world, wanting it so. Those who come to know that they have an intrinsic worth, such as that they have a worth that is irrespective of what they make of themselves in this world, irrespective of their achievements. Okay. That's the important thing. This is not a worth that depends on what you've done, on what you've made of yourself, on your accomplishments, on who you've impressed. But a worth that's more fundamental than all of that. The experience that brings that home to you is also an experience that brings home the intrinsic worth of all other beings. Right? Because when you know yourself as an object of that kind of divine love, you know that you are here because some divine power wants you here, and not because you've done anything at all to deserve it, but it's given to you freely and generously and given to every other being who is here. And if it wasn't given, they wouldn't be here. That their very existence is being sustained by this loving power. And to know that and to feel that about yourself, even in the absence of having any idea what you're supposed to make of your life, right? And it might be an absolute wreck, a total disaster, right? You might have squandered all your resources and opportunities right? And just missed every chance that was generously given to you, to make something good of yourself. And nonetheless, some divine loving heart is pouring love into your body, and it's coursing through your veins and making your heart beat and making your diaphragm move and making sensation and thought turn through your head and animating you and giving you an opportunity to wake up and realize that that's happening, which is perhaps the greatest opportunity of your embodied existence, is to know it, to be aware of it, and then to open yourself up to receive it. Now, one who is touched by an experience like that, right? However, confused they remain about what to do next. I'm speaking from some experience about the confusion part, is sees the intrinsic worth of all sentient beings, of all living beings, knows that worth, right? And when such a person has that in view, right? Has it in view, when it's lucid to you, and you know what I'm talking about. We all do. We all know this somehow. That somehow, that when it's lucid for us, when we see it clearly, when we see the inherent dignity of human existence, and then we look out at other people, right? What's reflected back to those people through our eyes is reassuring on a deep spiritual level. The level at which the newborn infant needs the mother or the mother figure to lift her up and hold her to the heart. A recognition that you belong here, that this existence, this embodied existence, has some kind of inherent worth and dignity and meaning, even if the purpose of it is elusive and unclear. It's different, right? Because if you, even just to have a sense of yourself as an object of divine love, imbues human life with profound meaning, even if the purpose of what you do from day to day is still kind of, or of everything that's happened to you, that's still, a total mystery. Let me put it a different way. When you're in your spiritual strength and you look out on the world and you see that divine light shining through the eyes of all the people around you, the way that you look at them lifts them up. The way that you look at them quietly reassures them that they belong here. That you see them, or perhaps something divine sees them through you. Right? And it's a small gesture, it's a small offering, but it's an essential one for human community. It's essential. Right? What if none of us did that for the others? Right? What if you lived in a world where no one looked at you with kind, warm, loving eyes? If we know what happens to the newborn baby who doesn't receive that kind of nourishment, is it really so different even when you're in your adulthood? Right? Perhaps the body is established enough in this plane that it will continue to live on, right? But imagine how cold, how barren a world would be in which no one welcomed the other with warm and loving eyes. You would say it's a world in which no one saw anyone else. It's a world in which I think the soul might understandably not want to live. So this is something that we do for one another, and something that we need to do for one another is to be in our spiritual strength, right? Because we slip in and out of it. You know the inherent worth and dignity of all human beings. You believe in it. Sometimes you see it. Sometimes you see the light shining from the hearts of other embodied beings. At other times, they look like a bunch of obstacles in your path. That's what it's like. Sometimes you remember, sometimes you forget. When you walk around the corner and you see someone look at you a certain way, it might help you remember, right? And we take turns doing that for each other, don't we? We take turns being in our spiritual strength and reminding each other, hey, it's worth it to be here. It's worth it for you to be you. You belong here with us. I'm glad you're here. There's a consciousness that's trying to take root in all of us. And sometimes it's pretty well rooted, and sometimes the wind blows rather hard and it slips away. And we forget. But to bring that consciousness down into the body, that consciousness that recognizes the intrinsic worth of all other beings, right, is of vital human importance. Now, I find personally that yoga really helps. For me, asana, pranayama, sitting in the silence before dawn with a nice cup of tea and just watching the thoughts slowly start to condense and then fade into the mist. Somehow, this helps me to feel the warmth circulating in my body as something generous and loving. And then sometimes, if I really sort of cultivate that and open myself to that, it helps me to see other people more clearly. Even when they're suffering, when they're angry, when they're grumpy, they're distracted, or perhaps being unkind, or just super ungrounded, that I can nonetheless hold their intrinsic, that I can nonetheless see the light, shining from them, even if it's rather buried or rather dark. That really helps me. Mm-hmm. I think that I'm not alone in that, right? I know I'm not alone in that, and finding yoga to be profoundly helpful in clearing away what distracts me from that more lucid mode of seeing other people and of seeing what's actually happening. Of seeing the beauty of other souls, of seeing the spark of an eternal consciousness inside of them. And I think that when then we practice together, it's as if we're all silently and implicitly expressing our desire to be in that consciousness, and so to hold one another in a clearer view. It's as if when I go into the yoga shala and the other people are there early in the morning, it's almost as if we're silently saying to each other, I'm here because I want to do what I need to do to really see myself in you to see you clearly and show up for you in the way that the dignity of your existence demands. And that's a beautiful thing. That itself is nourishing. That itself it warms me, it warms my heart to see people showing up in that way. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Now look, the consciousness that I'm talking about is also the same consciousness that's at issue when people discuss human rights, universal human rights, right? As being predicated on an understanding of the inherent worth and dignity of all human beings, right? This is, of course, more of a philosophical and kind of legalistic language, right? It doesn't come home to you in the same visceral way when you speak about it like that, but that kind of language is just as important. It's just as important, right? It's a way of symbolizing and talking about a mode of consciousness in a certain space where being in that consciousness cannot simply be assumed. It can't be taken for granted that everyone is in that consciousness. In fact, they're rather unlikely to be, it turns out, right? Yet nonetheless, people who are working for human rights, whether they're a lawyer, or maybe they're a political philosopher, or maybe they're an activist of any kind, or a journalist, right? Or a protester, or anyone who's outraged at these abuses of human dignity, right, are fighting for this same consciousness that I'm talking about now. Because if there wasn't this loving consciousness that I'm talking about in the context of yoga, if there wasn't that loving consciousness, there wouldn't be this language of human rights. Do you understand? When we're talking about in the yoga space, like that's where you really feel it, right? That's where it comes home to you. That's where you feel it in your heart, and not just as a kind of political commitment, right? As you see, you know what that's like, right? In the political sphere, seeing people talk as if they believe in basic human rights and then underwriting, with their political actions, genocide and other atrocities. Right? You understand that there probably is some part of them that believes, or at least knows that they should believe, that in the fundamental dignity of all human beings, but they just don't see it. They don't actually see it, right? Because if you see it, war is not an option. When you're in that consciousness in which you see lucidly the inherent worth of all human beings, killing is not an option. So anything that humanity does that helps to bring that consciousness down into the body, that helps it to take a firmer root, and I'm talking about a consciousness in which an unconditional love for this existence and its beings can circulate. Anything that human beings do that helps that consciousness ground itself more fully in the body is precious, absolutely valuable, essential, right? So, my sort of awkward contribution is to teach yoga. because I don't have any talent for anything else. And so many of you have talents and abilities and resources to to hold space for other people, to breathe, to feel into the body, and to open their minds and senses and their hearts to the circulation of the unconditional love that sustains all of creation. And holding space for that is a beautiful, noble thing to do. And for those of you who are keeping your yoga studios open, even in the Middle East, we commend you, and we stand with you, and we thank you for what you're doing. So please don't lose heart, don't lose hope. Believe in the intrinsic worth of what you're doing, and let's continue to support each other and to see each other, to recognize each other, and to love each other.